Hi folks, Lou here, and I'm going to talk about a possibly obscure, possibly not aspect of rules writing. In general, that aspect is whenever you write anything, but especially game rules, you have to assume that the reader knows certain things or does not know certain things. And if you get that assumption wrong, a lot of people are not going to understand your rules. Language is like that. You assume people know what words mean, but you can recognize that using $10 or $20 words is not a good idea in certain kinds of writing. That doesn't mean you need to write everything at third, fourth level, grade level, but you've got to recognize who your audience is and what they're going to manage to cope with. As an example of this general problem, I read a set of rules for a game called Robin Hood. Uh, It was published, I believe, but it's not currently available. There's more than one game of Robin Hood around. And this was, of course, before the game was published. And clearly, this was the designer's first game, assumed that people knew a lot more about certain aspects of gaming than they do, or than they're likely to if they buy a game called Robin Hood, thinking they're got Maid Marian and Robin Hood the good guy and all that stuff. These are aspects that war gamers generally know, but other people, maybe even other gamers, are not going to know. So the problem is, can the non-war gamers understand this game with the rules written as they are? And I think it would have been quite a struggle. It puts me in mind of a story about Avalon Hill, that they were selling games very well in Toys R Us, which was a big retailer back then. And of course, you may or may not know that Avalon Hill's best-selling game was called Faction 5. It had nothing to do with warfare. And Toys R Us said, okay, your games are selling well. Put whatever you want on the shelves. We'll see how it goes. And supposedly then Avalon Hill sent them games like Panzer Blitz and others that people bought and then couldn't figure out and took back. Now, it's not that they couldn't figure out in many cases, that they didn't want to figure out the complexity or the very topic. It may just have been something that wasn't very attractive to them. Panzer Blitz was not a simple game. And some of the others at Avalon Hill evidently were not simple games. So, among other things, Avalon Hill was assuming that people would know things in order to understand rules that they probably didn't know. Now, I've seen this at various times. My in-laws on the English side were bridge players, but they didn't play much in the way of other games. And I had them play test some of my simplest games and saw how much that an ordinary gamer would recognize and know that they did not know. They simply did not understand it because they hadn't encountered it. So I had to rewrite the rules to try to make more of that understandable, although at some point you have to draw a line or you might have very long rules. And that's a problem of another sort. More recently, I visited grandnephews and a grandniece who I had never seen before, um, two 7-year-olds, a 10-year-old, and a 12-year-old. And they played one of my simplest games. And it was interesting to see what they got and what they didn't. There were some cards in the game that had a fair bit of text on them. Most of them were very simple. And the 7-year-old struggled with it. They played, but they struggled with what the meaning was. And one of them said, you should make a game for 7-year-olds. And the obvious way to do that is I'm going to pull those cards out of there. And the core of the game is still there. But I'll tell people, take those cards out if you've got really young players. Now, that's related to this whole idea that there are going to be rules that people don't understand because they're not accustomed to playing this sort of game that you're writing the rules for. I mean, these kids like to play Alphabet Go Fish, a very simple game where you got a hand of cards. Uh, there were cards from A through Z, 2 cards each in the deck, and it was your turn. You could ask somebody else if they had a card, and if they did, they would give you that card. And when you made a pair of cards, you laid it down, and that was the point. And that was the whole game. In fact, they got quite exercised, I'll say, when the 12-year-old decided to ask for a card that she didn't have in her hand. Oh, that's cheating. You can't do that. And of course, they looked it up in the rules, and there's nothing against it in the rules. It may not be the best strategy, but it certainly stirred things up. But that's the sort of game they were accustomed to playing. And it's difficult to make a game simpler than that, or perhaps even as simple. Even my simplest game is a little more complicated than that. My game involves pulling pieces out of a bag, and you have to make sets with the pieces according to the cards in your hand and score points. So it's pretty darn simple, but those cards with a lot of text on them made it a little more complicated and a little harder to understand for the 7-year-olds. So the takeaway here is you have to know who your audience is when you write a set of rules, and you have to know what they know and what they don't know. Now, that's not easy, but one of the most important things in games is figuring out your target audience and then accommodating that target audience. Because if you don't do one of those two things, if you don't do both those things, then you'll probably have a disconnect between the game and the people who might be playing. Thanks for listening.